The night shift. There's something about it that feels different. It's as if the world slows down, the shadows stretch longer, and strange things lurk just out of sight. People always assume night shifts are quiet, uneventful. But what happens when the darkness hides something more? Tonight, I have 3 true stories for you. Stories from people who thought the worst part of their job was boredom, until the things they feared most came creeping into their reality. 3 tales of terror from the depths of the night. Let's begin, if you dare. Mike was just an ordinary security guard. Late 20s, new to the job. He had taken a night shift at an old office building downtown, an old building with its fair share of creaks and groans. His duties were simple: monitor the cameras, make rounds through the empty hallways, and report anything unusual. Easy, right? For the first few weeks it was. The most exciting part of Mike's night was brewing another cup of coffee. But one evening, as the clock struck 3 a.m., something changed. He saw it, just a flicker at first on one of the security monitors. A shadow at the far end of the hallway on the 4th floor. At first, Mike thought nothing of it. Shadows play tricks on you when you're tired. But the next night, it happened again. And this time the shadow moved. Not fast, but slow, deliberate, like someone walking, watching. His heart began to race, and a cold sweat formed on his forehead. There was no one else in the building. The next night, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was around 2:45 a.m. when he saw it again, this time clearer. The figure wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was tall, humanoid, standing just on the edge of the camera's range. Its head tilted, as if it knew Mike was watching. Mike swallowed hard. He wasn't sure whether to check it out or stay glued to the monitors. But something was compelling him to see it with his own eyes. He grabbed his flashlight, forcing himself to ignore the trembling in his hands, and made his way to the 4th floor. The hallway was as empty as it had always been. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but just as Mike started to convince himself it was all in his head, the lights flickered. And there, at the far end of the hallway, was the figure again. It was motionless, but this time, Mike could see its face pale, drawn, and with eyes so dark, they seemed like empty sockets. He aimed his flashlight directly at the figure, and nothing. The beam passed through it like smoke. The shadow evaporated, but the chill in the air remained. For the next few nights, the figure continued to haunt the security cameras. Each time it came closer. One night, it stood just a few feet away from the lens, its face more distorted, its eyes, if you could call them that, wider, deeper, darker. The cameras began to malfunction, cutting out whenever the figure appeared, static, flickering. But it was always there. Mike started dreading the night shift, but he needed the job. So he stayed. One night, the cameras went completely black, except for one focused on the hallway, just outside the security room. Mike stared at the monitor, and slowly, the figure appeared on the screen, standing just outside his door. Panicking, Mike grabbed his flashlight and flung open the door. But the hallway was empty. He turned back to the monitor, and his blood froze. The figure was no longer in the hallway, it was standing behind him. He spun around, heart pounding, but again nothing. Mike raced out of the building that night, abandoning his shift. But before he left for good, he checked the security footage one last time. He rewound it to the moment he had seen the figure on the monitor behind him. What he saw chilled him to his core. On the tape, Mike stood frozen in front of the monitor, but in the reflection of the glass behind him, the figure stood inches from his back, its eyes staring directly into his. No one else saw the figure. No one believed Mike's story. But even now, every new security guard hired at that building claims to feel watched, claims to see shadows in the cameras, shadows with eyes that never blink. Hospitals at night are never truly silent. There's always the hum of machines, the soft rustle of sheets, the occasional beeping of heart monitors. But one night, Nurse Emily was assigned to a ward that had been closed for months. Empty rooms. No patients. No reason to be there, or so she thought. It was supposed to be routine, a simple check to ensure no one had wandered in. But from the moment she stepped onto that ward, something felt wrong. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, colder than the rest of the hospital. Her footsteps echoed strangely, as if the walls were pressing in around her. Emily tried to keep her mind occupied, telling herself it was just an old building. But then, as she walked past one of the patient rooms, she heard it. A faint whisper. Soft, barely audible, but undeniably real. She stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't imagined it, someone or something had spoken. She pushed open the door slowly, her hand trembling on the knob. Inside, the room was empty, but the bed wasn't. A patient chart lay on the sheets, freshly placed. It had her name on it. Emily. And beneath her name was a date, tonight's date. Emily blinked, her pulse quickening. The paper was cold to the touch, almost too cold, as if it had been sitting in a freezer. She turned to leave, but as she did, she heard it again, the whisper, this time louder, clearer. Someone was calling her name. Emily, Emily, she turned back toward the bed, and there, standing in the far corner of the room, was a figure draped in a hospital gown. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes, wide, white, and unblinking, shone through the darkness. Frozen in place, Emily watched as the figure began to move, slowly at first, then faster, gliding toward her without ever touching the ground. She bolted, rushing down the hallway toward the nurse's station, her heart thundering in her ears. But as she reached the station, the lights flickered, plunging the ward into darkness. In the dark, the whispering continued, growing louder, surrounding her from every direction. Desperate, she grabbed her flashlight, shining it down the hallway, and there, at the end, was the figure again, standing perfectly still, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. She turned to run again, but the doors were all locked, sealed tight. And as she pounded on them, begging for someone to let her out, the whispering grew deafening. It was coming from inside her own head. Emily screamed, the flashlight trembling in her hand, as she turned back to face the figure. It was inches from her now, its cold breath brushing against her skin. It whispered her name again, this time in a voice that wasn't human. Suddenly, the doors burst open, and Emily stumbled into the main ward. She looked back one last time, expecting to see the figure, but it was gone. The hallway was empty, and the lights flickered back to life. They found her hours later, unconscious on the floor, her patient chart still clutched in her hand. She never returned to work. But the nurses who took over her shift claim the ward isn't as empty as it seems. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., the lights flicker, and a cold chill grips the air in the ward. Our final story takes us to a stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. Mark, a long-haul trucker, had driven the same route for years. Nothing ever changed on the road, endless miles of pavement, with only the occasional rest stop to break the monotony. But one foggy night, something changed. Something followed him. It started as a faint light in his rearview mirror. Mark figured it was another truck, but no matter how far he drove, the light never came closer. It stayed just far enough behind him, barely visible through the fog. After hours of driving, Mark finally pulled into a rest stop, thinking he had lost the light. He stepped out of his truck, stretching his legs, when he noticed something odd. The highway was completely empty. No cars, no lights, nothing but fog. But as he started to walk toward the rest stop, he heard it, a soft tapping. At first, he thought it was coming from inside his truck. He leaned in, pressing his ear against the window, listening carefully. But the tapping grew louder, as if it was right behind him. Mark spun around, expecting to see someone, but the parking lot was empty. He shook it off, telling himself he was just tired. He climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and settled in for some sleep. But as soon as he closed his eyes, the tapping returned. This time, louder, coming from the passenger side window. Slowly he turned his head, and there, sitting in the passenger seat, was a woman. Her face pale, her eyes wide and hollow. She didn't speak, didn't move, she just stared. Mark jumped out of the truck, slamming the door behind him. But when he looked back, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if no one had ever been there. He looked back at the flickering lights of the rest stop. There was an uneasiness to this place. Fighting the chill running down his spine and steeling himself, Mark hurried back into the truck and started the engine, speeding away from the rest stop. His heart hammered in his chest as he fumbled with his keys, desperate to escape whatever nightmare lurked in that place. The engine snarled to life, and he jammed the truck into gear, tearing down the dark, fog-choked highway. He'd driven a distance away, and for a brief, precious moment, a calm, almost warm silence surrounded him, the road stretching ahead like a lifeline through the mist. He dared to hope he was safe, that whatever haunted him had finally vanished. Mark took another turn down a bend in the road, looking uneasily at his rearview mirror, then drove around another bend. But just as the tension in his chest began to ease, the faint, pale glow returned in his rearview mirror. At first it was barely visible, a ghostly distant shimmer swallowed by the fog. But slowly, inevitably, it brightened, becoming a single, steady light. His hands tightened on the wheel as he watched it grow closer, pressing into the fog. He tore his eyes from the mirror to see the road ahead when suddenly he caught something in the corner of his eye, a chill immediately spreading through him. But when he looked back again, his stomach dropped. She was there, sitting in the back seat, her eyes wide, hollow and locked onto his, as if she'd never left. He looked back to the road, willing himself to ignore her, that it was all in his head, willing himself to keep driving. But then, he felt something cold brush against his shoulder. An icy fingertip, barely grazing his skin, but enough to send a shiver that froze him to his core. His breath hitched, hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't bring himself to look again, but he could feel her there, her gaze digging into him, her breath cold against his neck, as if whispering words he couldn't understand. The fog thickened, swallowing the edges of the road. The pale light in his mirror pulsed like a heartbeat, a reminder that he was not alone and could never be again. The dawn arrived quietly, pale light filtering through the fog, casting a ghostly glow over the highway. Mark's truck was found parked by the side of the road, engine idling, a soft rumble disturbing the morning silence. The driver's seat was empty, the door slightly ajar, swaying gently in the early morning breeze, but Mark was nowhere to be found. The police inspected the scene, finding only one clue. A faint radio transmission picked up the previous night, filled with static and a voice in the background, as if someone was trying to break through the static. A familiar voice, Mark's voice, came on. It was garbled, slightly muffled in the static, barely intelligible. But there was something else, another voice, low and whispering, intertwining with his. They said he was speaking nonsense, something about eyes in the mirror, about a woman in white. And then there was a laugh, soft, unsettling, like a breath just behind your ear, and the line went dead. They say that if you drive that same stretch of highway in the dead of night, you might see his truck parked by the side of the road. And if you're brave enough to slow down, you might notice something else. She's still there, in the passenger seat, her lifeless gaze fixed forward, as if waiting for someone new to join her. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you listen closely, you'll hear a faint, rhythmic tapping on your own window, like someone knocking to be let in. So the next time you find yourself driving alone down a lonely highway, be careful who you leave behind. Because some things, once they find you, never let go. The night shift, it's a strange place. When the world sleeps and the darkness takes over, strange things happen. But remember, the next time you find yourself working late, you might not be alone. Something could be watching, waiting just beyond the shadows. If these stories kept you up tonight, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this. And tell me, which one haunted you the most?